If you paid attention to the GTX 960 revisit, you probably noticed that I retired the Ryzen 5 3600 in the favor of the Ryzen 5 5600. But how much do you stand to gain from such an upgrade? And with the 5600 being significantly more expensive than the 3600, is it worth it? Just like the 3600, the Zen 3 based Ryzen 5 5600 uses 6 cores and 12 threads. The L3 cache is the same size as with the previous generation CPU. The frequencies are a bit higher by 200 extra MHz or about 5%. Like we did with the other CPUs, I did time how much the CPU took for the last rendering steps for the Gigasus R9-270 video. I then used that to calculate the number of clock cycles needed, with the intent of ranking it in terms of IPC against other CPUs, and boy did I get a surprise. But until we get to that, let's see how the CPU fared in a few games by running it with 32GB of 3600 MHz DDR4 in dual channel, together with an RX 580. Yeah, I know, not the fastest GPU. And to avoid it being the bottleneck, I ran all the tests at lowest resolutions and quality settings. And the first game to give me a bit of eye strain is Marvel Rivals. As mentioned already, to avoid the GPU bottleneck, I used lowest settings 720 resolution and 30% render scale. The Ryzen 5 5600 averaged 173 FPS, with 1% lows at 136, which is way too much for my skill level. Thing is, the GPU was likely still the bottleneck here. In the case of Cyberpunk 2077, I went for 720 resolution and FSR performance, again to avoid the old Polaris card from being the bottleneck. I got 106 FPS on average and 81 for the 1% lows. I think that the CPU will do just fine in this game. Fortnite has the much beloved, in my opinion, performance rendering mode. This then allows hitting a CPU bottleneck at 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The system gets an average of 240 FPS with the 1% lows at 153. And the reason I played this bad has nothing to do with the Ryzen 5 5600. I'm not sure that I hit the CPU's limits in Rainbow Six Siege. Low settings 720 resolution and 25% rendering scale still had higher FPS numbers than at 50% rendering scale. So I went even lower than that, at 1024 by 768, 25% render scale. That got 328 FPS on average and 236 FPS for the 1% lows. Again, the CPU is fine, it's my GPU that is the problem. At 720 resolution and low settings, Apex Legends managed an average of 206 FPS, with 1% lows of 143. The Ryzen 5 5600 will run this game just fine, and if this seems lower than the numbers we got with the Ryzen 5 3600, keep in mind that back then Apex Legends would still run on DirectX 11, and that the resolution used back then was quite smaller. For Doom Eternal I went for 1280 by 720 and low settings. The Ryzen 5 5600 managed 202 FPS for the average and 141 FPS for the 1% lows. I need to point out that the game has a relatively low CPU usage, so the GPU might be holding back the system here. Overwatch 2 has a 600 FPS frame rate cap, and this will affect the recorded statistics since at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and the low settings, the CPU will spend most of the time limited by the mentioned FPS cap. The Ryzen 5 5600 averages 600 FPS and runs the 1% lows up to 500 FPS. For testing Far Cry 6, I used the canned benchmark at 1280 by 720 and low settings. Also, the rendering scale was set to 50% to force a CPU bottleneck. The performance metrics came as 154 FPS for the average and just a little under 120 for the 1% lows. I think I got Counter-Strike 2 to run CPU limited, because the difference in performance between 720 low settings and 720 low settings and performance FSR was about 34 FPS. So, in a bot match on DA Dust, the Ryzen 5 5600 averages around 330 FPS with 1% lows at around 140. Resident Evil 4 will not be held back by the CPU. Granted, my standards of 30 plus FPS for the 1% lows is fairly easy to reach in a CPU limited test. At 720 resolution, low settings and FSR set to performance, the system averaged 140 FPS and the 1% lows got into the low 70s. I blame the GPU for those. DOTA 2 is easy to run CPU limited at low settings, even when running in Full HD. In the case of the Ryzen 5 5600, this means 171 FPS for the average and 76 FPS for the 1% lows. The gap between the two is quite large, but I think it's unavoidable when watching a replay and the camera switches from one lane to another quite frequently. The finals plays well on the Ryzen 5 5600. At low settings, 720 resolution and 50% rendering scale, the average FPS got close to 160, while the 1% lows stayed above 100. The game will play quite well, unlike me. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is typically not played in a CPU-bound scenario, but just for curiosity, I ran the canned benchmark at low settings, 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The Ryzen 5 5600 averaged 152 FPS and drove the 1% lows up to mid-70s. The ratio between the 1% lows and the average FPS is better in Borderlands 3 though. The test was quite similar as with the previous game. The canned benchmark, very low settings, 720 resolution and 50% render scale, and the results were almost 140 FPS for the average and almost 100 for the 1% lows. The last game we're going to check is Control. The test was the same run from the ventilation control point to the top of the NCP power plant. I went for 960 by 540 and the low settings, and the CPU averaged 166 FPS and got the 1% lows close to 80. What I call the Gigasus test consists in getting the count of clock cycles needed to perform the final rendering step for the R9 video, the one with a gigabyte PCB and an Asus cooler. The time needed to complete the task, about 548 seconds, gets multiplied with the number of cores and average frequency, giving a final result of 14,127 billion clock cycles. Compared to the other CPUs, it points out that the Zen 3 does have better IPC than Zen 2, but by only 4%. I wonder how much of it is due to the 3600 MHz RAM used, compared to the 3000 MHz kit used with the older chip. Don't get me wrong, this is an improvement, but less than what I expected, at least considering the price for the Zen 3 chip. You see, the Ryzen 5 5600 seems to be suffering from the same pricing issue that affects all final parts for a given platform. As seen from the price comparison on screen, a lot of the times the Zen 3 part is twice the price of the corresponding Zen 2 chip, much like the older quad-core i7s are twice the price of the corresponding i5s. And here's the thing. The only selling point for the 5600 was supposed to be the increased IPC. Now I'm not sure about you, but I'm not that impressed. And did I mention that the Ryzen 5 3600 is also a PCIe Gen 4 part? At 80 USD, or even 110 for the T variant, the price to performance is quite poor for the Ryzen 5 5600 compared to its slightly older relative, the 3600. I would rather get that one, unless you can find the newer part for at 50 USD or less. But enough with this good part bad price video. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it.